Today is Tuesday, August 18th, 2020, which means it's another episode of Garaaga Day. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? Void wept, but it's hot out there. Absolutely ridiculous. It's actually cooler in Alexandria, freaking Egypt, than it is here in Houston. Kind of runs against the stereotype, doesn't it? Alas, I'm not here to complain about the heat. There are some things going on behind the scenes that may or may not play out. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'll be biting my nails until something real happens. I hate for the vague status, but yeah, things happen. In other news, after another week in Austin, I'm still cranking on robots and software. I'm enjoying it, but it is rather draining. I'm home this week, so I'll be playing catch-up on lots of projects, including the Trident recording for my patrons and getting podcasts actually out on time for a change. I'm busy. Still getting the writing done as best I can, but it's taking longer than I'd like, just like everything else on my creative plate. Okay, enough complaining and blue skying. Let's get back to the library and see what Herodo is up to. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 13 of Legends of Garaaga.
The meeting hall was full. Herodo sat in the second row on the west side. The head librarian, Cleotis, stood in the center of the three-quarter round room. The short, nearly bald man stared at each of the students and staff with angry eyes until the room quieted. Herodo stifled a yawn behind his hand. Few things brought Cleotis's wrath as swiftly as a person yawning when he was trying to speak. The morning swim had been less than pleasant due to the sounds of fighting some streets away. Once the room was bathed in silence, Cleotis's mouth turned into a bright smile. "Good morning!" Cleotis's high-pitched voice filled the room. The man was a born orator, even if he sounded like he'd never grown into manhood. The staff and students said nothing in reply. "I have a few announcements before we begin the day. The Roman leader, Julius Caesar, has assured me that no harm will befall the library or its denizens. To ensure our safety, Caesar is posting more centurions to protect our home." The room's eerie silence broke with a rustle of nervous whispers. Cleotis stood perfectly still and waited. The room gradually quieted again. "Although Caesar has promised to protect the library, he cannot guarantee anyone's safety should they leave. Therefore, he recommends all students and staff remain in the library until further notice." Herodo felt a tap on his shoulder. Isaac mouthed, "What about Sabbath?" "We know tomorrow is a sacred day for Jews," Cleotis said. Both Isaac and Herodo turned to regard the Greek. His eyes bore into them both. "I have given permission for the scribe hall to be used for tomorrow morning's worship." The other Jews in the hall seemed to smile and nod at the same time. Cleotis's smile disappeared. "This will not be allowed to stop work, however. You have until second meal. After that, I expect everyone to return to work. Caesar has also promised to ensure we are stocked with sufficient provisions to feed the staff and students. Those of you who live outside the library will be given quarters in the dormitories." Another rustle of outraged conversation broke out. "What about my wife? My family?" a voice demanded. Cleotis stared around the room. Silence gradually returned under his gaze. "I know this is an imposition, but I must ask that no women, no children, and no whores," he said with a leer, "be allowed in the dormitories. We will be at capacity. Those who do not obey the rules may be asked to leave." "Leave?" Cleotis turned toward the eastern seating section. "Leave, as in never to return." The hall seemed to hold its breath. "Caesar promises it is only for a few days." "Did Caesar say why?" "No, Philandros, he did not." Cleotis glared at the large bearded man in the front row. "If I may finish?" Herodo took in a breath. Philandros, the library's wrestling champion and head of elements, was hardly someone to take such a dressing down in public, if it had been anyone but Cleotis. "I am not privy to the great Caesar's plans. Ptolemy sent a messenger to us yesterday, promising the library would not be harmed. Cleopas smiled, his yellow teeth contrasting against his dark olive skin. Although the two armies are locked in combat, the library is considered out of bounds by both sides. Cleopas surveyed the room. Therefore, I expect lectures to go on as per normal. I expect the scribes to continue translating, and I expect students to continue learning. The war outside these grounds is no excuse to cease the pursuit of knowledge. The room remained silent. Now, are there any questions? Herodot could feel the room's tension. The expression on the head librarian's face promised stern retribution if anyone uttered a word. Then you are dismissed for your daily studies and work. Cleopas bowed. The room's silence was broken by the whispers of fabric rubbing against stone, the creak and crack of old bones, and sighs of relief. The collective body knew better than to begin conversing until they left the great hall. Isaac tapped him on the shoulder. See you upstairs. Herodot nodded. Isaac proceeded down the steps and out the door. Several other students remained sitting. Cleopas walked to a pitcher of water and filled a stone cup. Herodot inwardly sighed. If Cleopas was drinking water, this would be a long lecture. Scribe Hall was filled with the sounds of rustling papyrus, styluses scratching, and many quiet conversations. The afternoon sun warmed the library, but the cool sea breeze kept the room comfortable. Herodot wiped his sweat cloth across his forehead. One had to be careful during the day's inking. Sweat on the papyrus could easily turn fine lettering into indecipherable black smudges. He leaned back, lifted his hands above his head, and cracked his spine. Too early for that. Isaac yawned from the next table. Herodot grunted and looked down at the tablet. It was the last of the tablets in a year of Akkadian history. Before long, he'd be done with it and heading back to the catalog room for another load. And how is the great writer today? Strange, Herodot said. His voice is changing, almost as though his passion for the work had somehow dwindled. In what way? Herodot placed his stylus on the table. The language is not as rich, it's more matter-of-fact. Herodot frowned at the tablet. The great poet seems to have forgotten how to describe his world. Perhaps something changed? Perhaps. Herodot rubbed his eyes with the sleeve of his tunic. Is that the last for the year? Yes. Isaac smiled. Then you'll find more. The smile was infectious. Yes, there's always more from Tupsoro. Always more. One day they're going to run out, you know. The man had to have died at some point. I know, Herodot sighed, and I want to put that knowledge off as long as possible. Isaac? A voice bellowed from the front of the hall. Sir! Akakios, Herodot's patron and the scribe leader, stood red-faced. Get back to work, the man growled. Isaac bowed his head. He has the head of an ass, Isaac whispered. Herodot shook his head and stifled a giggle. At least 3 times a day, Akakios bellowed at someone. Isaac was his favorite target, and Isaac deserved it more than most. The older man paused between scrolls to talk, joke, and stare at the ocean through his small window. If not for the fact he was an accomplished translator of Aramaic and Hieratic, Akakios would have dismissed him from the library years ago. Another set of scratches on the papyrus, and the tablet was finished. Herodot leaned back and surveyed the words on the scroll. He was certain of his translation's accuracy, and that fact impressed him. Were the rest of Tupsoro's writings going to be so terse and lifeless? The joy of translating them, of immersing himself in the rich descriptions of Akkadian daily life, was the reason he worked so late into the night and looked forward to every morning. Without Tupsoro... Herodot raised his head. Akakios was engaged in a conversation with 2 Roman soldiers and an Egyptian. He placed the stylus in the holder and stared at it. Ink is his blood, Cleopas had said during the morning lecture. Blood powers the body. Without it, we die. History is kept alive by those who write it down. All we know about the world's beginning was written down from oral telling and retelling of legends. The head librarian had paused and then stared at Herodotus. Where did the story of your Yahweh come from? Herodotus cleared his throat and felt a flush of embarrassment rise in his cheeks. From Abraham, from Yahweh himself. The hall chuckled. Cleopas smiled. That is a Jew's answer. What is a scholar's answer? That Abraham passed down the stories, that at some point they were written down by scribes. Scribes like yourself. Herodotus nodded. Cleopas surveyed the room, his bright, dangerous eyes daring anyone to utter a breath. History, my brethren, is only as accurate or as pertinent as those who tell it, make it. Memory is fickle. Gods fade with time. They die from history when their supplicants do not keep them alive through song, story, and writing. We are witnesses to a great battle. The remnants of Alexander's legacy and that of Rome's rise. But if we do not record it, who will be left to tell the tale? Caesar and Ptolemy, a voice ventured. Cleopas turned and faced the west seats. Yes, Hiram, Caesar and Ptolemy. And if only the victor is left to speak, then how will the war be remembered? Herodotus nodded in spite of himself. No one in the hall dared answer one of Cleopas's rhetorical questions, unless they desired a vitriolic rebuke. The old librarian stared down at the floor. You scribes, you perform the function of the gods themselves. You make history, which is why you must be so accurate, so painstakingly methodical in your trade. He looked up. Have any of you read the story of Narratal of Babylon? The hall was silent. Cleopas's smile grew. I thought not. Those of you working through Akkadian and Babylonian history should read it. It is an interesting tale, to be sure. Philus, a high-ranking soldier in Alexander's army, wrote the account after interviewing his friend Narratal. Philus does not vouch for the veracity of the man's story, but felt it worthy enough to keep alive through history. If more people like Philus existed during Babylon's pinnacle, we might know all there is to know about the civilization. Herodotus cleared his throat. Cleopas's eyes snapped to him. But we know much, sir, very much. Cleopas's smile remained, but his narrowed eyes showed anger. What do we know, scribe? What do we know of their wars? The dredging of the great river? Excuse me, sir, the tablets I've been translating closely chronicle the Akkadian civilization, at least a period of it. The old Greek frowned. See me after the lecture, Herodotus. Cleopas coughed and then stamped his foot. Now, colleagues, let's discuss Alexander and the Indus Valley. Herodotus, Akakio's voice yelled. The young scribe looked up. Sir? Are you done with that tablet, or are you planning on marrying it? The hall snickered. Sorry, sir. Yes, sir. Face flushed, he blew on the scroll to ensure the ink had dried, rolled, and tied it. With a sigh, he walked to the front and handed the scroll to the librarian. Akakios grunted. You want more, boy? Aye, sir. A gruff smile broke out across the old man's face. Then get to it, son. Herodotus nodded his head and made his way to the great hallway. With fresh torches lighting the storage area, Herodotus still felt a wave of claustrophobia, but the great fear he had experienced the night before was mercifully absent. A single Roman soldier stood guard outside the room's only entryway. The centurion smirked and gestured toward the room. Not much of an invitation, but Herodotus was used to it. Most of the Roman soldiers saw little value in the library. The works, the scribes, the continual study of history, lectures and discussions of the sciences made little sense to them. Theirs had become a culture of war and conquest. Except for luminaries like Cicero, Rome had few enlightened men remaining. They left that to the Greeks and the Jews, Caesar certainly paid lip service to scholarly endeavors, but Herodo doubted the ruler had much true interest. He stepped into the room and immediately made his way toward the wall of tablets. He knelt and placed Tupsoro's last day of the year into its proper slot. How many do I want this time? He asked himself. With a sigh, he pulled the next 3 and began walking from the hall. The 3 tablets were heavy, thicker than the last set. His eyes swung toward the grate in the floor, and he frowned. It was askew, as if someone had pushed up from beneath it. The metal was scarred in places. Soldier? He called. The centurion walked into the room, a scowl on his face. Yes, scribe. Herodo nodded to the grate. Do you see it? How it's off center? Guard grunted. Must have shifted somehow. I don't think so. I think I'll take care of it, the centurion growled. Herodo bowed to the man and headed out of the room. Romans, he whispered. He returned to the scribe hall, made his way down the aisle and to his station. Herodo placed the tablets on his desk and frowned at them. These were larger, much larger than any of the previous Tupsoro tablets. He felt a sinking in the pit of his stomach. Had he finally run out of the ancient scribe's works and started on someone else's? Herodo pulled a sheaf of papyrus from beneath the table. He noticed Isaac's raised eyebrows and shrugged. Don't know, he whispered. Isaac shook his head and went back to his translation. The young Jew swiveled the first tablet toward himself and read the first few marks. Same hand, same scribe. Tupsoro. Good, Isaac said without looking up. Get to it, Herodo. He'd barely heard Isaac. The first sentence alone was enough to make his breath stop in his throat. My name is Triani, Herodo muttered. With trembling fingers, he began to scratch upon the scroll.